Welcome to the Experimental Honesty Podcast. I'm Brian Curtis. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Brian Gunia. Brian is a professor and associate dean for academic programs at the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. His research focuses on simple, theoretically motivated interventions to help people act more ethically, to negotiate more effectively, and to improve their lives by improving their sleep. Brian recently wrote a really great review article titled Sleep and Deception that was published this year in 2022 in the journal Current Opinion in Psychology. And this explores the indirect relationships and the direct relationships between unhealthy sleep and unethical decision-making, with a primary emphasis on deception. Now, sleep and honesty are two of the central focuses in my work as a clinical psychologist. I was really excited to learn about Brian and his work and to get the chance to chat with him about the intersection of these two fields of study. One of my hopes for this episode is to further bring together researchers and clinicians in the field of sleep medicine with researchers that are doing work in honesty, deception, moral reasoning, to continue this really interesting work that Brian will elaborate on here in a bit. You can learn more about Brian and his work by visiting his website at briangunia.com. That's BrianGunia.com. And as always, if you're interested in getting a free year of the soon-to-be-released Experimental Honesty app by testing and giving feedback on the initial version releases, you can head over to experimentalhonesty.com. Okay, let's talk to Brian. Okay, so I'm here with Dr. Brian Gunia. So Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to chat today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
All right, so I will give you an official bio in the introduction here, but I guess I should just start saying I get email notifications whenever there's an article published on anything related to honesty, deception, lying, and also sleep, right? And so those are two of my primary interests. And so when I saw your recent review article that we'll probably focus on today titled Sleep and Deception that came out in Current Opinion in Psychology really grabbed my attention. I think I reached out to you right after I read the article. And so thanks for A, making the time. And I guess B, given your interests, self-defeating choices, there's acting ethically or unethically. You've written a book on negotiation. And now with your interest in sleep, can you maybe talk a little bit about how you describe that kind of journey, your path to becoming interested in these diverse topics?
Sure. Yeah. So it's really, I would say mostly a personal path. I have a number of family members that worked in organizations where, a number of self-defeating choices were made, and that I saw the impact that could have on them personally and, professionally over the course of their lives. I've certainly worked in organizations where things go wrong, and they don't necessarily have to because of those types of choices. And was a consultant for a period of time, so also was part of big projects where people were trying to implement a good idea and a good initiative, but it went awry because of choices that people made. So really, I had a lot of personal experiences in that domain over the course of my life. I wouldn't initially categorize them as negotiation and ethics and sleep, but when I got to Northwestern to do my PhD, I started focusing on the first two, negotiations and ethics, because I realized a lot of the choices that we face and a lot of the ways we go wrong, can be categorized as matters of negotiation or matters of ethics. The sleep piece came a bit later when I was a parent and had trouble sleeping myself. But I would say also, since I've been at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, I've started working with the military community here, and they care quite a bit about the effect of sleep on soldiers. And so that, both on the personal and the professional side, I realized that sleep is a big category of professional mistakes as well. So I would really group all three together as common mistakes that people make in organizations: negotiating ineffectively, acting unethically, and sleeping insufficiently. I see them through the same lens, even though they're three diverse topics.
Yeah, for sure. And so in stalking you online on your website, I saw you have two daughters. Is that right?
I have two daughters, and
Yeah.
so you can probably guess when I started getting interested in sleep.
Well, and that's interesting too for me. My background, my history is with insomnia since like age 10. That was 21 years. And so it took me becoming a sleep clinician, a sleep specialist, to touch some of the interventions you actually talk about in the review article. But definitely having children, we've doubled you. We have 4 young kiddos here. So definitely raising kids, disrupting sleep, and then the implications it has for things like impulsivity, for can you stick with that values consistent diet, or, deception, that communication and relationship. So it's
Yep.
interesting to know that you came to that personally as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And sleep has a lot of effects on your personal life, but I'm in a business school and it has a lot of effects on organizational life and work life as well. And so I tend to think about it in terms of the mistakes that people make in the workplace, but obviously at home, mistakes and issues are just as important, if not more.
Yeah. So when in your article, you lay out, there's this really beautiful theoretical model that you have of all of these constructs in the paper. And it's really, the underlying thing is unhealthy sleep leading to these outcomes, these unethical decisions. And so we can touch any part of the model as we kind of talk through this. But in general, just kind of interested in this kind of overview to set us up for the conversation, wherever you want to take us in thinking about sleep and deception, and how you kind of came across all the various literatures to pull them together and to integrate it into this model. Yeah, let's just maybe chat about that wherever we want to start.
Sure. Yeah. So, I think the first thing to note is, as you said, it's a review paper. So it's not just my research that I'm writing about. I'm trying to summarize a body of literature. But
Mhm.
basically, what I'm doing in the paper, and what the paper suggests, is that a lack of sleep or low quality sleep can influence decisions that can be categorized as ethical. Ethical decisions there's a lot of different types of ethical decisions. Some put kind of two ethical values into contrast. For example, a choice between being loyal to somebody and doing what's honest or what's just. They can also come in the category of doing kind of what you're tempted to do versus what you should do. That the latter is the main focus of the review article. How does sleep affect people's right wrong decisions when they're tempted to do wrong instead of adhering to their ethical choices? But there's a larger body of literature that it's rooted in, saying that basically a lack of sleep or low quality sleep can impair people's ability to make all kinds of decisions involving values.
hmm And that was one piece that really stood out, is that emphasis on unhealthy sleep or disrupted sleep, or as we can talk about too, the role of leaders in organizations. You mentioned the military,
Yep.
prioritizing sleep or not prioritizing sleep. There's this body of research about when people face moral dilemmas, they can really go against their own values when sleep disruption is on the table, right? So, yeah, can you talk maybe a little bit about what that literature suggests in terms of, let's say, values and these moral dilemmas when we're sleep deprived?
Sure. Yeah, I think you're referring to a literature that has largely emerged from the military studies of like Navy officers, for example. These studies, what they do is they tend to sleep deprive people, so they bring them into a laboratory and actually prevent them from sleeping, or they study them in a natural setting in which they're sleep deprived, and then look at how do people resolve conflicts between two values, like the conflict between loyalty and honesty that I was mentioning a second ago.
hmm
The literature finds a number of different things, but the main point of that emerges from the literature is that when people are sleep deprived, or when they've experienced low quality sleep, they tend to struggle with those types of decisions. They have a harder time making them. They take longer making those decisions. The reason seems to be that being sleep deprived or having unhealthy sleep for another reason causes people to abandon more complicated moral reasoning. So if they tend to really think through things and the pros and the cons from an ethical point of view, it's harder to do that when you're sleep deprived. You rely more on kind of simple rules and heuristics. So what that means, and this is the part that I find really, really interesting, but also really troubling, is the most, morally advanced people, the people that tend to make the most well-reasoned moral decisions, are the ones that are most at risk in these types of decisions, because they're the ones that really need the capacity to, think through the complicated moral reasoning required to make the right decision. And so that, the findings are mixed. So I wouldn't state that too strongly, but that's sort of a troubling implication, that those of us that are the most ethical or the most moral are the most at risk of abandoning our preferred principle, because we just don't have the capacity when we're sleep deprived to apply complex moral reasoning.
Yeah, and you talk about there's these specific professions too of, I believe, physicians, other people in these more ethical type of roles. And so, yeah, in your own experience, when you say it's very interesting, but also troubling, I don't know if even in your own personal experience in your day-to-day life, I mean, have you seen this come up in those type of professionals or those type of professions where once you kind of have that lens, it's just hard to not see it when you make this link between something like sleep and moral reasoning and that cognitive load that happens. We just don't reason as well, right? We rely on heuristics, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't personally tried to classify occupations into those in which people get low sleep and correlate that with those in which people are less ethical. I think that's an interesting research question for somebody to do. I have looked at occupations. Some of this is work with Emma Levine, who I know has been with you before. We've looked at occupations and categorized those in which unethical behavior is seen as more of a good thing, and those in which it's seen as more of a bad thing. I haven't linked that to sleep, but I think that's an interesting question. Is that in part because those occupations are also those in which people are really sleep deprived and really sort of struggling to maintain their sleep schedule? I'm sure that there's some sort of a link there, but that remains to be studied.
Yeah, and I think that was, to me, in reading your review, I mean, having been interested in this stuff for years and years, I hadn't done the deep dive into the literature. And so one of the takeaways from this work is, wow, we just have a lot more to do. A lot of these connections, there's a few studies that have, like you mentioned, we can experimentally sleep deprive people. We see how they do ethically. But really bringing these fields together in ethics and in deception and honesty, and then all the sleep folks, right, who are doing this more experimental work, to bring these people together to say, well, how do we start to influence this, and how do we start to intervene to improve it? It's just a big open kind of a question mark. And so that was encouraging for me. I mean, it was interesting to notice there's not that much out there, relatively speaking, but then the opportunity for collaboration and bringing these fields together seems to be pretty large.
Yeah, I think the landscape is wide open as far as this research. I mean, there's a big research in medicine on sleep, and we know a lot about the health effects, the clinical effects of a lack of sleep. There, over the last decade or so, there's been more work on how sleep affects people's behavior in more of a behavioral setting, like an organization. So, I mean, that's starting to happen, and the general conclusion is parallel to the clinical literature, that lacking sleep or having poor sleep has bad effects. But then there's kind of countercurrents to that are emerging right now as well. One is, given that many of us can't control our lack of sleep, given other family demands or work demands, is there anything good at all that comes out of poor sleep? And that's something I've done a little bit of research on. And then interestingly as well, is there anything that organizations in particular can do to help their employees sleep any better? Or do they just simply have to kind of accept an employee's level of sleep as given, once they walk in the door? So I think those are kind of two areas of emerging interest, but there's still a lot of opportunities for the clinical side of sleep psychology and sleep physiology to pair with the behavioral side, because behavioral researchers are good at behavioral research, but tend not to use kind of clinical methods, and vice versa for the clinical community. So there's really a lot of complementarity between the two, and I'd like to see more of that.
Yeah, me too. Absolutely. It's really, really important points. And so what you touched on here is let's say in the leadership roles, there's this notion of sleep leadership that you mentioned and that you've done work on with Army soldiers. Can you maybe talk about, the implications of people that have roles of influence? Okay, and their opinions on sleep, whether they value it or devalue it, and how that might impact the behavior of people associated with them, maybe under them, in terms of various outcomes, but deception in particular is what you mentioned in the article. Yeah, can you talk about, I guess, sleep leadership for a bit?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, there's a longstanding literature in organizational behavior that shows that organizations and what happens in organizations spills over in negative ways to people's home life, including their sleep. So, being stressed out at work, or having kind of, too big of a span of control, or having something troubling happen at work, will harm your sleep at home. And that's a well-established fact that organizations can hurt people's sleep at home. There's been, much less to almost no research until more recently on whether organizations can do anything positive that has a positive impact on people's sleep at home. I'm glad that the tide is beginning to turn on that. There's research on, for example, training programs that organizations can put in place to kind of teach employees about the importance of sleep hygiene, like not checking your phone, right before you're sleeping, or answering emails late at night. The area that I've studied is what you mentioned, sleep leadership, which is just the idea that, it's not just that leaders and their behavior in organizations can have negative spillovers to how well you sleep. They can have positive spillovers. So sleep leadership is basically the idea that the very simple things that leaders say and do in the workplace about sleep can have a pretty strong impact on how much and how well people sleep at home. And importantly, how well they sleep at home then has a spillover back at work. And so the idea is basically, by either inquiring about sleep, asking about sleep, expressing interest in sleep on the one hand, that's one piece of sleep leadership. And on the other hand, maybe making small changes to the work schedule or the work conditions to accommodate people's sleep schedules. By doing those two things, which are really simple and often costless type of nudges in organizations, by doing those things, we've shown that in an Army sample, for example, soldiers tend to sleep better both now and several months down the line. And in fact, it's not just kind of a correlation. There's an actual change in sleep quality and sleep quantity. Soldiers are sleeping better over time to the extent that they have a leader that engages in those types of behaviors. And then also, that, as I said, that has a spillover effect back at work. For soldiers, work is, being on the battlefield or on the base. And so these soldiers are indicating that they are better able to control their impulses. They're better able to make tough decisions, avoid emotions like emotional outbursts like anger. So, all kinds of things that organizations are looking to achieve, whether they're, the military or not, are byproducts down the road of sleep leadership. So I hope that this and other work on this topic starts to kind of suggest that, organizations aren't just all bad when it comes to sleep. Organizations can have a positive effect on employees' sleep. Of course, there's other questions about, is that ethically appropriate for organizations to be, intervening in something that clearly takes place at home and not in the workplace. So I think that's important as well.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I mean, I guess fundamentally it's prioritizing the well-being of the people that you're working with or that you're supervising. And so,
Yep.
especially in the Army populations, and so I also do work in post-traumatic stress disorder and the overlap with chronic insomnia, nightmare disorder,
Yep.
and like you're mentioning, emotion dysregulation. And such a huge theme that comes up is in my training, it was sleep was kind of the enemy. You need to be vigilant. You need to have your head on a swivel. You need to be aware. And so when you think about this concept of sleep leadership and in your own experience, let's say it can be in military, Army personnel, how do you go about talking to folks who might have been, exposed or kind of brought up in that environment where sleep is almost weakness? Right. Sleep is something to be avoided. What's your experience with all of that?
Yeah, I think it's an important question. It's a difficult question. My hope is that society is changing for the better in that respect, because I think to some extent it's a generational thing. Younger generations of individuals, and including younger generations of soldiers within the Army, seem to me to be more in tune with health considerations, wearing Fitbits and tracking your sleep and prioritizing things like that. I think the pandemic has had some impact on that, in the sense that a lot of people are, the pandemic sort of alerted a lot of people to the fact that they need to prioritize things like sleep and mental health and emotional well-being. So, my hope is that things are swinging in that direction, but I think there's a lot of countercurrents as well, right? I mean, there's a reason why organizations hamper people's sleep and ask more of them than maybe they should ask. Sometimes there's a lot of incentives to do that, and so I think in part it's a generational issue, but in part it's going to require concerted training efforts and a business case for the fact that this isn't just about being a nice manager. There's a business case to be made for this. In a medical context, for example, which we think a lot about at Johns Hopkins. You would think based on the literature that sleep leadership would lead doctors or nurses or whoever to sleep better in a home setting, which should lead to kind of better patient outcomes, better patient satisfaction in the workplace. Those are things that organizations care a lot about, and so the hope would be that the business case plus the swing in society would lead to a better appreciation for this kind of thing in the future. That said, there's very little of research, at least that I know about, on culture change about sleep, and so that's an area that I really want to look at with collaborators in the future. Is how can we affect culture change when it comes to this idea that lacking sleep is a badge of honor, because while that may be the case, and there's some reason to think that bonds people together and makes them feel like part of the group and they've been through the experience or whatever, there's also a lot of negative effects that come out of that organizations should care about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in the sleep, research and clinical community, this notion of sleep health that I know you touch on in your work too, really not just looking at the sleep disorders, things like insomnia, things, that's, clinically there, but just in general, this sleep health. You mentioned sleep hygiene. You also, note in the article things like mindfulness, cognitive behavioral therapy strategies, in particular for insomnia. A lot of things we can do to kind of improve the well-being, right, of people in terms of sleep. And like you mentioned too, viewing this is a big win-win. So for people, they get their sleep, their emotions are better regulated, they can actually encode and store memories, they're less impulsive, and guess what? Reduced medical errors, productivity goes up, work absenteeism goes down. So having that shift, and I would say any collaborators interested, reach out to Brian. He's he's on board with it. It sounds like, for sure.
I'm on board. And one other thing I wanted to say about that is, I study with as you mentioned, I study the military quite a bit, and they're really at the forefront, I think, of this in some respects. I mean, for example, in Army leadership training, they extensively cover the importance of sleep, right? And they train leaders within the Army now in sleep leadership. Like when you're leading somebody on the battlefield, make sure that what you're doing doesn't come at the expense of sleep, because that is going to lead to negative outcomes, in combat. And so I think in some respects, non-military organizations have something to learn from that context, because they really appreciate that and have incorporated that into their training and in the way that they think about leadership.
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. One thing I didn't see highlighted specifically in the article, but given your background in working on ethics and ethical behavior, did you come across, or do you have thoughts about, I mean, I think a lot about this, which is the flip side of the model, which is the unethical behaviors, let's say deception or lying. We need to keep track of that now. That can then increase stress throughout the day. It's on our minds, that whole how can you sleep at night type of thing. Do we know anything, or I don't know if you have thoughts about that inverse, which is those unethical behaviors then leading to sleep disruption, which then starts this cascade. In other words, we can intervene with sleep, but we can also intervene with that ethical piece and having people have more awareness about honesty in daily life, moral reminders, that kind of stuff. I don't know if you have thoughts on that or if you came across that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's research on unethical behavior per se leading to poor sleep at night. At least I haven't seen that research, if it exists, but it would be consistent with what does exist, which is that unresolved anxieties from the day that you're mulling over at night, certainly can lead to insomnia, can lead to waking up in the middle of the night and not being able to go back to sleep. So, I think you would find that if you studied that, doing something suspect that leads to rumination, that spills into sleep would cause people to have sleep problems. So if that's the case, then that could be a bad cycle, right? Like you said, right? I mean, the unethical behavior leads to poor sleep, leads to worse unethical behavior as things unfold. And so that would be an interesting thing to study the non-virtuous cycle that could come out of that.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and so much of this is about cycles, right? When you look at how this starts, and anywhere to intervene can be a promising avenue. So, I guess in speaking of intervention, you touch on a number of methods, right, that we can do to presumably decrease these deception-related behaviors. Okay. And we talked about a little bit of this before, but so those cognitive behavioral interventions, talking about sleep health, you mentioned things like mindfulness, emotional intelligence, self-control, caffeine. I mean, there's a lot here. As you were going through this and as you kind of think about moving this into the future and kind of practical applications that maybe listeners can start considering if they're interested, what kind of jumped out to you, and what kind of methods seemed really promising to you as you went through this literature?
I think more needs to be done on social influence as it pertains to sleep.
Mm.
In part, the people that are around us influence how much we sleep, and so that ties back to what we were talking about a second ago: is how do you change norms within organizations to encourage sleep rather than devalue sleep? But also, social influence affects uh, the effects of sleep on your behavior, right? So if you sleep poorly and you're facing an unethical temptation, there's a number of different papers that show that the advice you seek out and the advice you receive from others can turn that off or turn that on, right?
Mhm.
If you seek out those that you know are going to support a devious, unethical point of view, then chances are that'll exacerbate it. If you seek out those that are going to give you more kind of ethical counsel, that I have some other research that shows that can be effective as well. Contemplation is another thing. Forcing yourself to have a cooling off period when you're about to make a decision. There's some evidence that can often help people set aside temptations and even temptations induced by poor sleep. I think that's pretty interesting. There is an effect, as you mentioned in the literature, that caffeine can help, at least temporarily,
Mhm.
reduce the effects of poor sleep. Obviously, caffeine has other negative effects and may affect your sleep the next night. And so I think there's a limit to that. But those are some that I'm interested in. The other thing I would say is I do think that there's almost no research on how low sleep and poor sleep might positively affect people's outcomes in the workplace. And given that many of us can't control, or at least have limited control over our sleep hours, I think we owe it to ourselves to know, are there any potentially positive spillover effects of that in the workplace or in a professional context or even in a personal context, just given that, it's going to happen anyway. So,
Yeah, that was really interesting as I read that. And so as a sleep clinician, I'll just note part of that is people might be doom scrolling social media until 2 or 3 a.m. and then they have to get up at 7. So
yeah.
that insufficient sleep syndrome, just having that awareness of how much of a priority that kind of sleep leadership to our daily life are we prioritizing for sleep? But let's just say we do have, let's say, young kids, hypothetically here, Brian, right? But I mean, so if you have these in positions, it's really hard to shift it around, and your sleep is getting disrupted anyway. Yeah, let's maybe talk a little bit about how some of those positive outcomes that might result from some sleep disruption that we know can happen in different contexts. Yeah, let's. I think creativity was one of those, but I think there's a couple others you touched on, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would speculate that there's a number of positive outcomes that could arise from negative sleep. And by the way, before I get to that, I mean, I don't mean to be all doom and gloom. Like, even if people can't control how many hours they sleep, they can control to some extent, or they can at least influence their sleep quality. For
Hmm.
example, don't check your phone for an hour before you go to sleep, right? I mean, that's hard to do for those of us that like to be on our smartphone or be on social media or whatever. But that's a simple enough way to influence potentially the sleep quality that you have and your ability to fall asleep within whatever window you have. So I don't mean to be all doom and gloom, but if you take as the assumption that people have a fixed amount of sleep and a fixed quality of sleep, the effect that I've studied is, does that influence their ability to make kind of tough, risky decisions? And a context in which that happens a lot is when individuals are thinking about starting a business. The entrepreneurial context, oftentimes people have an idea, an intuition, a hunch that they want to start a business, or they want to sell a product, or they want to do something, or perhaps they want to change jobs, quit an organization where they're not quiet quit, but like loudly quit an organization and
Hmm.
start their own organization. People have a feeling that they want to do that, but it's a very risky thing to do. And so when they're well rested and when they're able to think it over sufficiently, and when they're marshaling all their cognitive resources, they decide against it as maybe the not the prudent thing to do. I have a couple of papers and lines of research at this point that suggest that being sleep deprived actually nudges people toward starting a business and being more entrepreneurial and expressing more entrepreneurial intentions. So, I would never encourage anybody to go sleep deprive yourself or not sleep sufficiently in order to be entrepreneurial. But, I take that as at least a little bit of a silver lining that, there are decisions we have to make, whether we're an entrepreneur or not, that involve taking a leap of faith, taking a risk. It seems to me that based on that research, lacking sleep, having poor quality sleep can nudge people toward taking the plunge, taking the leap, making those types of decisions and committing to a risky course of action. After that, of course, you don't want to be sleep deprived anymore. It's not good to run a business when you're not when you're not sleeping. Then all the unethical behavior and everything else can kick in. But that may give people the initial nudge they need to make a risky decision. And you can think about other organizational contexts where that would happen, right? Like a CEO of an organization needs to decide, should we make an offer to buy this other organization? Well, you never know everything you need to know to make that decision. That's a risky decision. To the extent that that's the right thing to do, maybe being a little sleep deprived could nudge them to take action.
Yeah, there's a lot of literature on like the experimental protocols you mentioned and things like delay discounting, right? We tend to discount the benefits of these bigger rewards over the long term. We want that immediate, more impulsive, rewarding aspect, and sleep influences that. And so, yeah, using it, if you are, that can be a tool, it sounds like, to get over some of that maybe too conservative. We're not really pursuing the things that really interest us. So some of that cognitive impairment, we can say, right, we might be a little bit more impulsive, but if channeled in the direction of, let's say, your values, what you really want, that can be one kind of upside of sleep disruption, if I'm hearing you right here in that context.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the key is to identify in what situations is being impulsive, if not good, at least not as bad. I mean, so there's some contexts that require impulsivity just because you don't have the data you need to make the decision. You have to act, otherwise you're just frozen, and nothing happens. And so, in any of those contexts, you would think that being sleep deprived can provide a useful nudge potentially.
And I guess that would hit that depleted self-control, one of those aspects that you mentioned there too, that I don't know if there's more to say there, but it seems like that self-regulatory, self-control aspect is what we're kind of centering in on here with sleep disruption, right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, sleep disruption has, and unhealthy sleep has a lot of effects on, psychologically and physically and emotionally and behaviorally on people. But the one that the literature on deception focuses on is largely self-control. The idea being that when people, I mean, even ignoring sleep for a second, when people self-control is depleted because they've been having to exert it in the past on something, they've done a difficult task, they've taken a test. There's a study about taking a test. Anytime we do something that depletes our self-control, we're more prone to act unethically. So this ties to sleep because we know that poor sleep also causes a decrement in self-control that's akin to doing a depleting task. And so that self-control is the mediator that a lot of this literature focuses on. When people sleep poorly or sleep insufficiently, they don't have the cognitive self-control, self-regulatory resources that they otherwise would to set aside the temptation in favor of their kind of longer-term, more diffuse goal to be ethical.
Yeah. And what was coming up as you were kind of saying that, and we're talking about this is, I mean, in your role too, academically, right? You also teach in addition to doing your research, correct?
Yeah.
So your students, right? we know in, universities, that's a population. So I'm wondering, I don't know if you teach this aspect in terms of, the coursework you tend to do, but do you tend to see this in your students? Do they resonate with this idea? I don't know how much sleep you focus on, but I know in my own case, this is something the undergrads, let's say, or the graduate student population, they can definitely nod in agreement. They relate to this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody, whether they're a student or not, can relate to sleep and a lack of sleep is my experience. I teach negotiation primarily, and I talk about ethics within negotiation in that course. I don't talk as much about sleep, but whenever I do, often in response to a student question, that always resonates a lot with people because as I said, we all have experience, if not personal experience with others that have difficulty sleeping and the effects that has on social situations. Negotiations are one type of a social situation, and so you can easily see how that would cause people to act impulsively in a negotiation, which I would imagine is typically not the way you want to act in a negotiation.
Right. And again, just bringing this can be yet another tool. When you think about ethics, you think about in the business context, maybe another weight on the side of, organizations wanting to get more on board with this is it makes sense for management and everybody in the organization to be able to have their resources about them and to be able to, let's say, negotiate effectively, maybe in line with some of the work you've done in your book, right? That,
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I don't know. I just I wouldn't be overly optimistic, to be honest, on that, because it's the evidence has been there for a long time. The business case has been there for a long time, and we're still sleep deprived as a society. So I don't think the business case on its own is gonna do it. I think we need more than that. We need individuals in particular that work for organizations to prioritize this themselves, I think, and to insist on it. And that, I think, links to negotiation, right? Because when individuals prioritize their health and their sleep, and they find that the organization's not prioritizing that on their behalf, they should negotiate with their organization in order to make sure that they're looking after themselves. And so I think that there is a link between those two. It's interesting to see how this will shake out in the world of remote work, because people are on the one hand are more able to control their own schedule and their own sleep, but on the other hand, work and home bleed together, almost without a boundary, right? And so it's not clear to me whether this is going to improve people's sleep over time, or whether it's going to hurt people's sleep, just because they can never really kind of disconnect work from sleep or home or anything else.
Yeah. And I guess that would just be an invitation for being curious and experimenting with this, right? If people know, I mean, you just rely on your own experience. If you wake up and you feel like you could go back to sleep, it's a great sign that you still have sleepiness to burn
Yep.
off. And so what would it be like to give yourself an extra 30 minutes, or like you said, to put the smartphone, away a half an hour before you do, to dim half of the lights in the home to get that melatonin release? I mean, a lot of things we know can influence it, but how it impacts you day to day, just to test that out and to see, how are you in terms of, what's your, that kind of irritability fuse, right? How short, how much self-regulation do you have? And so just seeing in your own case, and then can you then apply that to your daily life moving forward, for
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's a research study there probably to look at people that recently returned to the office and people that didn't. You have two kind of groups, and
Hmm.
look at how much they're sleeping, look at their behavior on some comparable outcome, and see what happens. I'm sure it's a complicated relationship, complicated by many other factors as well. But I think that working at home versus working in the office is likely to have an effect on both on people's sleep and on their ethical behavior.
Yeah. And so as you've been diving into this literature, and as you think about your work, you think about the implications moving forward. I mean, where are you most excited in terms of where you want to see this go, when you think about stuff that it's just kind of self-motivating? You're really interested in steering this in a certain way. Where is your head at currently in terms of what you're focused on now, and where you really want to see this stuff moving down the road?
I mean, I guess I'll never lose the heart of a change management consultant, which is where I started with my career after college. That was my job as a consultant, and so I really think that changing cultures of badges of honor against sleep within organizations and within the broader economy is going to be a culture change. So I think it would be where I'd like to go personally, is to take more of a macro view of this, an organizational view of this, and look at how organizations, at least those that realize the importance of sleep, can actually go about changing the culture of their organization. It's just ingrained in a lot of organizations, the military being
Hmm.
an example, where it is a badge of honor in certain parts of the military not to sleep and to have to go through that grueling process. How do you go about the culture change? How do you convince people that this is a good idea? How do you get on board those that are really influential within the organization? I think there's a lot of we know, again, as I said, we have the business case, but we don't really know and always what to do with it, or how to take it from there. So I think looking at how organizations can affect change in this area is really important, and that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. Are there examples? I mean, the military, I think, is a great one in terms of maybe having the opposite bias, right? And kind of shifting that around. Are there examples of organizations who maybe have embraced this more than other people? I mean, I know with work environment, Google was the example of, hey, they have ping pong tables and they do, it's a different kind of environment. Are you aware of any organizations, or when you think about maybe pointing to some examples of people who have tried to move in this direction? I don't know if anything's coming up as I say that, but I'm personally not aware of anything coming to mind that they're kind of carrying the baton and moving this forward.
I mean, I think the closest thing that I'm aware of is organizations in the pandemic and post-pandemic that have said, during this period, we don't want you to be on your email, right? Or we don't want you to be
Mm.
we don't want you to be working during this period of time. We want to clearly demarcate the work and the home life. That's not usually, I don't think, with an eye to sleep. It's more with an eye to just kind of separating the workplace from the rest of life. But some organizations have been more explicit than others in that in that department. And so I think that that's a step in the right direction to clearly draw the boundary between the two, and acknowledge that it's okay to have a boundary, and it's okay for the two not to permeate with each other. And so that's something I'm studying right now as well. Is that the best approach, to draw a clear boundary, or is the best approach just to kind of accept that work and home are all part of one, at least for people that are remotely working on some regular schedule? And do we just need to accept that and go with something more like sleep leadership, where the leader recognizes that the two are intermingled with each other and just does what they can to prioritize sleep and convince the employee to prioritize sleep? And there's some cool research coming out now about wearables, about things that you can put on your head and they make clicks in your ear and synchronize your brain waves, and different Fitbits that at least tell you about your sleep. So lots of interesting work on wearables. So I think that'll be to the extent that organizations use those or buy those for their employees or recommend those, I think that could be interesting as well.
And I guess fundamentally, raising awareness about it, right? A lot of these wearables and the technologies, clinically, a lot of it, we're not really there in terms of sleep staging, like I was in REM sleep versus this stage. But in terms of sleep duration and noticing when you're getting into bed, how much you maybe slept, just having that on the radar, like you're mentioning, whether it's, this wearable or that one, if organizations are kind of taking that technological interest and merging it with, this is now part of the culture, and especially really important thing with remote work, right, where we can always be on, basically. And we can also shift that into just our personal experience. I know with me, I do telehealth, I work remotely. There's no reason I ever, it's a personal decision to not be always on. And that's been a continual process. As somebody who's in, academics, my background, with folks too, is, oh, you're on vacation or sabbatical. Now you can write your book. Now you can do this thing. Any personal experience now trying to strike that balance between, we leave work at work, we do this at home, sleep there. I'm just curious. I know in my own life, I can talk a lot about how the process has gone, but I'm curious for you, how this might be directly applicable to your kind of day to day.
Yeah, my own experience is that academics aren't very good at separating work and home. Work is a big part of individuals' identity and who they are and how they spend their cognitive time, whether they're at home or at work or anywhere else. Academics have always, to some extent, had some flexibility with where they work and how they work. And so I wouldn't point to academia as a good example of separating work and home. I agree that if you're on sabbatical, that provides some separation sometimes, but just in general, academics are not, at least I'm not as good at as I should be researching the subject at separating the two. I also have an administrative role as well, and so that I have a little bit of a blended role. So it becomes, I think, extra hard to separate work and home when you have those additional responsibilities.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely. There's just a lot we have in the paper. What haven't we touched so far? When you think about any of these aspects, we talk about these things separately. We have sleep, we have ethics, we have negotiation, but as we view it in this cycle, they all influence each other in this big loop. And so again, directing attention to any area can potentially improve this whole system that we have. Is there anything we really haven't focused on that, as you were going through this or currently, really stands out to you as maybe something interesting or something that, the listener might be, benefited from by being aware of that we haven't touched on?
I think the only thing really is we haven't talked about circadian rhythms as much.
Yeah, let's do that.
There's sort of two drivers of how sleepy an individual feels. One would be the homeostatic processes, which mean basically that as you go through the day, sleep pressure builds up, and when you get to the night, for most people, or at least most people that don't have a disorder of some kind, they need to release that sleep pressure at night by sleeping. So that's one of the processes, and the other one is circadian processes, which is a regular pattern of peaks and troughs in an individual cycle. More or less, everybody has the same kind of pattern. However, it's shifted to different points in the day. So some people are morning people, where they feel energetic in the morning, more energetic in the morning at least. And some people are evening people, where they are more energetic in the evening. And so I think this is a really exciting direction that the literature is going as well. Most of the research in an organizational setting, at least, has been about not enough sleep or low quality sleep. It hasn't been about when in the day are you making a decision or doing something within an organization. That's really important as well, because we know now, based on a few papers, that individuals, even the same individual, can act pretty differently at different points in the day, depending on where they are, in their cycle, right? So I have some research that shows that individuals that are morning people tend to be more ethical in the morning than in the evening when they're feeling most energetic. Mm-hmm. And then the opposite for evening people. Makes sense, right? Because it's the same type of process that we've been talking about. When you're feeling sleepy, whether that's because of not sleeping enough or because of the circadian rhythm, when you're feeling sleepy, you don't have those self-control resources to resist temptation that you would if you were not feeling sleepy. And so I think there needs to be more attention to intra-individual variations throughout the day as well. That's another thing that I hope to study more of in the future.
It's hugely needed. I mean, one thing that comes to mind that I know the sleep field has really leaned into is school start times, which is a similar thing of, hey, when you get to, let's say, high school age, we have this natural circadian delay. We become more night-ish. And so that early morning time, hey, we're not as cognitively efficient. Our decision-making goes down. There's in the places who have implemented maybe matching that start time more to their circadian pattern, less early morning car accidents, right? And so the grades went up. A similar approach now, you have that case example, but now applied to the business context, decision making, all of that stuff as well. I think that's hugely important. And I haven't seen a lot of, work empirically in that area. It sounds like you might be driving this forward.
Yeah, I mean, not within organizational behavior. There's a few papers now, and there's a recent review that came out, but there's a lot more to be done. I think there's more to be said on daylight savings time as well. I mean, this is every sleep researcher's bane of their existence is daylight savings time, because the day after the springtime change, there's all kinds of bad things that happen in terms of heart attacks and car accidents and arrests that shouldn't happen and all kinds of bad things, right? And so. Yeah. It's somewhat linked, because that's an artificial reduction in people's sleep. Of course, there's a reason why it happens, and it makes sense for other reasons. But from a sleep point of view, that deserves more research as well.
And it can be, on one hand, it can be shocking that just an hour difference from one day can have that dramatic of an impact on things like, there's cardiac incidents and, motor vehicle accidents. But that's also just for everyday people. That 1 hour shift can make a dramatic change. And so if you think about the decision you would make at 8 p.m. versus another time of the day, depending on if you're more of a night person or a morning lark. And again, that just requires this awareness of when do you tend to be at your best, you feel, and then when do you tend to make your decisions. And so can you do something to better align maybe those high cognitive times with that rhythm, if I'm hearing you correctly, in terms of maybe some of the directions you're wanting to move forward in the business context?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people are aware of that, right? Like they'll say, I'm going to do this at this portion of the day, and I'm not going to do this at that portion of the day. But the general message would be self-aware enough to know what you're good at different points in the day. Don't write that nasty email at night that you are tempted to write, but you're not alert at night. Save it until the morning when you've slept and you're feeling at your best, because you're a morning person. Then reevaluate the email before you send it, because that'll likely lead to a better outcome.
And I guess in terms of those ethical scenarios too, I mean, do you have that conversation, let's say, with your partner, or do you engage in something that would be ethically relevant or important? When do you decide to do that? When are you scheduling it? It also seems, that circadian influence, being more aware and mindful of when you're tending to do that, because based on your review and the evidence, we can be much more set up for, we just don't have the bandwidth, or we don't do the mental effort to align our behavior with our values. And so it can all feed into each other. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, again, it's a little bit out of individuals' control, in the sense that organizations set the workday to some extent. And so individuals have to align with the workday to some extent. However, we do have degrees of flexibility with how we structure our day in many cases, right? And so that to the extent you can schedule yourself to do certain kind of tasks when you're best equipped to do them, that's a better thing to do. For example, as an academic, I will never try to write a paper after about 6 p.m. I can write it, and then it'll be garbage, and the next day I'll have to start over. I'll always try to write in the morning when I'm at my best, and then do things that require a little less attention in the evening. But that's especially important for high stakes things like ethical decisions.
Yeah. One thing that I know that came up when you were talking is, so when we think about sleep leadership in organizations, obviously targeting the folks that are making these decisions, right, about prioritizing sleep or not. Is there anything that would be useful for, let's say, a listener is in an organization and they definitely don't prioritize sleep, or they think maybe I could do something, but I'm not quite sure where to start? Is there any evidence, or as you've been thinking about this, what folks might be able to do to kind of advocate for this area of their health, maybe in an organization who hasn't thought that much about this yet? Or are we kind of talking about, let's start with leadership first and see where we go?
I mean, I think there's a lot of people that are skeptical because there's a lot of counter arguments to be made for working really late and setting sleep aside. I mean, Thomas Edison, right?
That's right.
I think the quote is, "Sleep is a criminal waste of time," right? I mean, that's kind of embedded in our culture. So what I usually say in response to that type of thing is, I wouldn't encourage everybody to go from where they are right now to encouraging sleep leadership. I think a good first step is just to stop devaluing sleep with the things you say and the things you do. I mean, you don't have to prioritize sleep just to stop devaluing it. The things that there's good research that shows that simple things that leaders say not only can help individuals get better sleep, but they can really hurt people's sleep as well. So saying things like, do you really need to sleep that much, or shouldn't you stay up until midnight and get your work done, or something like that, really devalues and deprioritizes sleep. So I would start by dipping a toe in the water, stopping those types of statements. If that has an effect on employee satisfaction or the climate or the work product or whatever, then you can try more invasive types of things like sleep leadership. But it really doesn't. I don't see why anybody necessarily needs to make statements that devalue sleep. So that's pretty costless for individuals to try, or organizations to try training individuals to not make those types of statements.
Nice. Perfect. Well, I mean, there's so much more obviously that we could launch into and dive into here, but let's just say for listeners who, this has piqued their interest, they want to continue the conversation, what's the best way they can, find out more about you and your work, if they're interested in learning a bit more?
I think they can Google me, Brian with an I, and then my last name is Gunia. So that's the best way. I have both a Johns Hopkins website and a personal website. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Feel free to send me an email via one of the email addresses on my website. So I'm happy to connect with anybody that has an interest.
Cool. And that's the brian.gunia@jhu.edu, I know, is the one on your website, which is briangunia.com, correct?
That's correct. Yep.
And then I'll have to put a plug. There's your book, The Bartering Mindset, a mostly forgotten framework for mastering your next negotiation. That's published in 2019, and I think just came out in paperback this year. Is that right?
Yep, that's correct. And that does not touch on sleep at all. But if you have an interest in negotiation, that's my take on negotiation.
Cool. Well, once again, this is an article that I mean, I've been threatening myself to maybe write for 6 or 7 years, and I just never would have gotten around to it, I don't think. But when it hit my inbox, I was thrilled to see you're doing this work. I loved reading it. I would highly encourage people, if they can access it, to read it. And it touches on so much of our daily life when we think about ethics, decision making, business, mental health, physical health. It really is the foundation of so much of what we care about. And so once again, I just want to thank you for taking the time today and for all the work you do. It's incredibly important.
Thanks for having me. It's been my pleasure.